like and subscribe. Native Japanese people of Reddit, what do you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing? Native Japanese in my 20s. The bombings are in our collective mind, the representation of the atrocity of war. There is definitely a strong victim mentality, and the general public do not imagine ourselves to be the aggressors of history. We are completely oblivious to the other ***T we have committed, since the education system is structured in a way that let us sweep the past under the rug. We were graced by the USSR's intervention that enabled us to erase any acknowledgement of our pasts, and spent the last 75 years rebuilding our national identity around being meticulous hard workers. Our society is devoted to turning everyone into company robots, malleable with zero backbone. Voter turnout for people in their 20s is about 30%. We do not think about politics, and our knowledge of history is limited. So in short, BOMB equals BAD equals WAR, and that is about it. Native Japanese here. I do not have much to say about the political/tactical viewpoint, since I am not an expert, just a civilian. And I think that goes for most other civilians as well. The people who live through it, or whose parents and grandparents lived through it, only know the suffering it caused. In school we were taught dry facts about war, very little emphasis on why any decisions were made. But we did learn a lot about the effects on the common people, to the point where I was tired of spending so much time on it. We visited the bombing sites, heard survivors speak, touched the keloid scars on their arms that still burn decades later. We folded paper cranes, and were taught songs that denounced war and promoted peace, as though we were going to be able to make a difference. Today, most of us live quiet lives, and do not think about the atomic bombs, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or the land conflicts in Okinawa. But if asked, nearly every family has a war story, of would-be grandparents who died, or children who starved, because they were far enough from the conflict, but were still affected by the wartime economy. It is just part of life. We carry the inherited memory of suffering. Edit. There have been a lot of questions about education in Japan, and /u/flightless kite summarized it well. I didn't know about the atrocities committed by Japan until much later either, and it is still deeply upsetting. My answer to the original question is only that Japanese civilians suffered greatly, as did those in many other places. I'm native Japanese born and raised in Japan. As some of those fellow Japanese already mentioned, in Japanese education system the majority of focus is that we are the victim of the WWII, and I did believe that for the longest time. I've been to the museum in Hiroshima, and it's simply painful to see those images of people who were bombed. I never wish that to my worst enemy. A nuclear weapon should be terminated from this world. But having said that, the US government did not have a better understanding of long-lasting effect of nuclear weapons to begin with, and Japanese have even invading those neighbor countries, and doing horrendous acts in such place China, Korea, and other southeastern countries. Massacre and recruitment of comfort women is simply not acceptable and intolerable. It's extremely infuriating that many Japanese media or politicians dismissed those acts, especially comfort women, as something like every country did that, or it was a good paying job back then. I'm looking at you, Hashimoto. It saddens me to learn many Japanese friends of mine perceive this era of Japan as just a victim, and don't know too much about other historical contexts. But at the same time, many of them don't speak or read in English or other language, so it's difficult for them to be exposed to outside view. This might be a unpopular opinion, but I did appreciate that Obama paid a visit there during his presidency. After all, many people died because of the bomb, and many people, especially from Hiroshima, still struggle with certain health issues. So, long story short, I'm feeling very conflicted. Edit. Sorry, I didn't expect this to blow up this much. Sorry if I didn't respond to your comments. Edit. Okay, first edit was 100% unintentional. Thank you for pointing it out. Posting on behalf of a Japanese grandpa I know who was born and raised in Tokyo. We are both into history, so we've talked about it a lot. He views the bombings as terrible, but doesn't fully blame or hate the US for them. Instead, He blames the emperor for not listening to military advisors like Isoroku Yamamoto, who basically warned Japan that the war they were getting into was unwinnable. He maintains that Japanese wartime rations and famine and firebombing were just as horrific and happened for years, but the West doesn't talk about those as much. He acknowledges that he's more liberal than his countrymen in this regard, possibly because he was raised by a scholarly father/mother, his words. He was also an international salesman/salaryman in the 80s, so having that world exposure opened up some of his views, he said. He's also genuinely curious about what the American home front was like, so I've swapped stories between my own 94-year-old grandmother and him. And I try to bring him English books about the era when I visit, as Japanese publishers don't cover the topic. To those unaware, Isoroku Yamamoto didn't develop these feelings late in the war. He acknowledged it almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. My mum is from Hiroshima, with her sister and parents still living there now. She has very differing views on the bombings than her family. My mum has the view that it was a necessary evil, due to the fact that it was a quick way of ending the war to prevent further bloodshed. Additionally, the knowledge of atrocities committed by the Japanese military greatly changed her view of the bombings. Whereas the rest of her family have the view that Japan was the victim and America was overstepping. I think this is because of the Japanese system, where very little of the atrocities are talked about. And it is mostly just about how Japan was a victim. My own personal view of the bombings are that it was required to end the war quickly. Coupled with the atrocities committed by the Japanese during the war, it was justified that the Allies dropped the bombs. I apologize for my bad grammar. This is as a result of being dyslexic. Apologizes for grammar. Writes perfect English. You're good, bro. It is a really conflicting feeling. For the longest time, I felt there was no justifying the bombings. The bombings really helped to paint the country as a victim of war when being taught in Japanese history classes, and of course no one, including myself, would question it. It is only when you learn about the other side of the coin and hear about the atrocities that are hidden in Japanese education, such as nanking and comfort women, that you realize that Japan is not in the clear. To this day, I still do not like the fact that my country still go to lengths to forget about their own wrongdoings. In the end, war itself is tragic. The bombings caused a lot of Japanese people to suffer, but we are not the only victims of war. Although I come from a Japanese family, I see other tragedies such as the Holocaust in the same light. As I personally did not suffer from war, I cannot say my way of thinking is correct. I'm from Japan. My views of it are very different now that I live outside of Japan compared to when I was younger and hadn't left Japan. When I was younger, I saw it as a horrible thing done to us. No excuses. No reason could justify the horrors of not only the nuclear bombs, but also the firebombings. I saw it as the evil's war and what warlike means could do to humanity. Japan was 100% the victim. When I was younger, it wasn't taught like JAPAN equals GOOD, AMERICA equals BAD. More of the bombs are the horrors of war, and this is why war is never a good thing. Now that I live in the US, I see it's not as simple or black and white. I now understand why the bombs were dropped. I still believe it was a horrible thing, but I do believe it stopped the war, which is a good thing. I now feel that what Unit 731 did is more of an example of what evil humanity can accomplish vs the nuclear bombs. But again, I no longer live in Japan, and my viewpoint will not be the same as people who have lived there their whole life. Native Japanese, half, here, grew up there through high school. The bombings themselves didn't directly affect my family, because my grandparents lived in Tokyo and great-grandparents and extended family in the countryside. My grandpa died before I was born, but he worked on a battleship in the war. My grandma would tell me how he used to tell her in secret how Japan could never win, because the US had so much more natural resources and was more technologically advanced, especially as the war progressed. Of course, he would have gotten in huge trouble if he had said any of this publicly. I grew up listening to stories and manga depicting the bombing, the aftermath, how people's skin would melt off, etc. I found it more fascinating than anything. My grandmother would tell me stories about the surrender. I think, and my grandmother agreed, that Japan was better off with the bombing as it brought an immediate end to the war. Far more Japanese would have died with a land invasion, as the imperial propaganda during the war was so thorough that civilians would have fought with spears rather than surrender. A lot of people were blindsided and confused by the emperor's surrender announcement, which was done over radio with archaic, even for the time, Japanese. Edit. A word plus this was the manga I remember reading when I was a kid. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/barefoot_gen. Native Okinawan here. Okinawa is where the Japanese soldiers decided to fight for the last battle of WWII. If it was not for the bombs, I feel as thought the Japanese would have never surrendered, and would have been completely massacred on the final battle of Okinawa, along with even more Okinawan natives. The Japanese soldiers occupied our land and drove the native Okinawans to the mountains, scavenging resources from civilians, and killing us, if we did not give up our hiding spots. My great-grandfather was stabbed in the stomach for not giving up his hiding cave but luckily survived. It is all terrible, but I can only imagine, if those bombs were not dropped, then what would have become of my people and the Japanese soldiers who were literally jumping off cliffs/disemboweling themselves/blowing themselves up, because they were told not to be captured as prisoners. I wish the Japanese had surrendered sooner, but they had too much pride. Fun fact, if you have played the original Cody World at War, the final stage is on Okinawa. Edit. Remove sarcastic remark about the video game. You've been visited by the ghost of a very important man. Pay your respects by liking and subscribing, and he'll grant you 3 weeks of good luck.